After much speculation, Russia has resumed supplies of gas to Europe via the Nord Stream pipeline after a 10-day maintenance break. The line is currently operating at around 40% capacity. There had been fears that Russia would not resume gas flows in order to push back against Western pressure over its invasion of Ukraine. Concerns that Russian supplies of gas could be stopped by Moscow prompted the European Union to tell member states yesterday to cut gas usage by 15% until March as an emergency step. This afternoon, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said the pipeline was not operating at full capacity due to technological problems, perhaps he meant technical problems, he blamed on European sanctions.
President Putin explained in absolute detail how many compressor stations and what kind of malfunctions there are. The malfunctions that are registered by Siemens. As a result, there is a situation where it is impossible to bring up the pressure in the pipeline to 100%. These are technological causes, related to the impossibility of proper technological maintenance. Any technological problems that are linked to it stem from the restrictions imposed by the European countries themselves, not European countries, to be precise, but the European Union. It is these restrictions that don't allow them to repair equipment, including turbines that operate at compression stations. And it is these restrictions that lead to the fact that some equipment units can't currently receive the necessary service.
Well, to look at this in more detail, I'm joined by Arise correspondent Laurie Laird. Good to see you, Laurie. So, temporary relief for Germany, Russian gas flowing once again to the country, albeit at a reduced level. The Kremlin still seeking to put pressure on Europe over its support for the war in Ukraine.
I'm having a little trouble hearing you. The audio isn't great, but I'm sure you've asked about what is happening with the Nord Stream pipeline. There was a lot of fear that Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, would not resume flows through Nord Stream after this 10-day shutdown, ostensibly for maintenance. Very big fears. In fact, the European Commission has voiced those fears and has asked every European Union country to voluntarily cut its gas usage by 15% to make sure that the supplies will be able to be rebuilt during the winter. Now, Russia has said that it intends to continue to supply gas through the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, but if sanctions prevent the acquisition of equipment for maintenance of the pipeline, that could be another story, and that flows could be cut down or even terminated altogether if Russia thinks that they aren't able to get the right equipment.
The German government, of course, scrambling to find alternative sources of energy amid concerns that Russia might close the tap for good. I mean, I understand it's turning again to coal.
Well, it's very difficult. Right now, there isn't necessarily a shortage of gas coming into Europe. It's the summertime, and ironically, while we're talking about the uses of gas, most of Western Europe is sweltering in an unprecedented heat wave. The problem is that this is normally the time of year where European gas consumers will tend to rebuild their stocks in preparation for the winter. The Europeans were doing that reasonably well. The European Commission has tried to instruct European countries to make sure their gas stocks are filled to about 80% by November 1st so that there's sufficient supply going into the European winter. Germany has said that they'd like to raise that to about 95% stocks right now, about 66% full. So there's still a long way to go in replenishing those stocks. And of course, capacity down that Nord Stream pipeline, which resumed today, is only running at about 40%. That will make it extremely difficult for Europe to put away supplies once winter comes.
Away from that a little bit, in the past few hours, Laurie, the European Central Bank announcing that it's raising interest rates by 0.5% to tackle soaring inflation. That's the first time it's done that in 11 years. And I understand that the bank specifically mentioned the threat of Russia cutting off gas supplies.
Well, you're absolutely right, Charles. The European Central Bank sprung a real shock on all of us. They raised interest rates by not, half a percentage point. That's about double what the European Central Bank had prepared us for back in June. Really caught people by surprise. And one of the things that the European Central Bank said is they referred, Christine Lagarde, the president of the bank, referred specifically to the war in Ukraine, referred specifically to the fear that gas will not flow on a regular basis down that Nord Stream pipeline into Europe. Were that to occur, that would mean ever more inflation. Inflation at a record high, 8.6% in the Eurozone at the moment. And of course, the fear is that if gas supplies are curtailed, that the price of gas will rise further. But gas is used in industrial processes. It's used to heat homes. So it really would have the effect of raising prices across the board. As I say, Christine Lagarde really was voiced fears on this, is incredibly concerned that this could be problematic for Europe going forward.
Very briefly, Laurie, the bank also announced an initiative that would help troubled Italy.
Charles, I'm sorry, we're still having audio problems, but one thing I would like to mention is if we could hark back to an earlier story, and that's the collapse of the Italian government. Mario Draghi, who was serving as prime minister, he is an ex-president of the European Central Bank and really regarded as one of the most gifted central bankers of his generation. His government has collapsed. Italy will be heading to new elections, and the big fear that the European Central Bank has, and the European Central Bank fears this almost as much as it fears very high inflation, and that's that heavily indebted countries such as Italy will have trouble paying their debts back while interest rates rise. And to that end, the European Central Bank today announced a new package, a new mechanism that will allow them to buy bonds of heavily indebted countries. They didn't mention Italy by name, but certainly the hint was if interest rates were to rise more heavily in Italy than in other countries,
right.
And that's something we've seen over the past couple of days with all this political chaos in Italy. If that were to be the case, the European Central Bank is prepared to step in and buy Italian bonds. That would take the yield, the interest rate on those bonds, push it down a little bit, right, and make it a little bit easier for Italy to shoulder its debt burden.
Laurie, thanks very much indeed. Laurie Laird, Rise correspondent, talking to me there from London.